What's going on, guys? It's the Unhinged Engineer here. Today, I'm going to talk about my SpaceX internship in detail for the first time. Now, I've alluded to having worked at SpaceX for a little bit in a couple of my videos up to now, but with all of the hype around SpaceX's IPO, I thought I'd share what it was actually like for me having worked there. In the 3 months I was there, I had a blast. I learned a ton. It was a really once-in-a-lifetime experience, and I like to think that some of the lessons I learned, the experience I had, are worth sharing with you if it's a place you're interested in working or are looking to intern at. Like I said, I'm the Unhinged Engineer. I make professional development content for other young engineers like myself. To start, I'll discuss some context of like what the position was, how I got there, stuff like that. Then I'll talk about what the work was like. I can't get into too much detail for kind of export and security reasons, but I'll talk about it in broad strokes, talk about what I did there, talk about what life was like working at SpaceX. I was there for a few months. I was living away from home. It was very interesting. And then I'll talk about my overall thoughts on the experience and advice I would have for anybody else who's going to embark on this journey soon. So I just have my notes on my iPad here. Starting off with context, the way I got this internship in the first place is actually pretty interesting. I was a senior in college and I was actually applying for a full-time GNC role. So GNC, as you might know, is Guidance, Navigation, and Control. When I mentioned on this channel that I've gotten to work in GNC before, aside from college where I did some research in it and took a bunch of classes, this is the main experience that I'm referring to. So this internship is the only time in my career where I actually had the official title of GNC engineer. But it wasn't a full-time role. So I did the series of SpaceX interviews, which is a whole video unto itself. The SpaceX interview process is really, really grueling, incredibly rigorous. I will say the recruiter and all the people I talked to were incredibly polite and friendly and great to work with. So no complaints on the recruitment side. That said, the rounds of interviews were incredibly challenging. So after several of those culminating in an on-site, I actually wound up not getting the full-time position. So I was pretty bummed at the time. The main reason I didn't get it, as reported by the hiring manager, was really that I was young. I hadn't even graduated with my bachelor's yet. And GNC is typically a role that requires a master's, or at least heavily favors people with masters. So I had amassed enough experience through other internships and classes that I could roll with the punches, but I did not have some of the advanced coursework and advanced knowledge that they were really looking for. So what they said was, if you are going to grad school and you want to do an internship with us before you start, come through. That's basically the feedback I got, which is obviously, again, very great. It's a very nice thing for them to say and a nice offer for them to make. Now, this is where things get interesting. I was not planning to go to grad school. As you may know from this channel, I'm currently taking night classes at Georgia Tech. But at the time, I hadn't signed up for this yet. I haven't even applied. I had actually blocked out 3 months after I graduated to backpack Europe, which is like the stereotypical college kid just graduated thing to do. So I was going to backpack Europe, but I hadn't even bought any tickets. I didn't have a plan. I was just like, I'm going to backpack Europe because that's what you're supposed to do. And I thought about it and I was like, I love travel. I had never been to Europe at the time. I have since, but I love travel and I always wanted to go to Europe and it was something I really wanted to do. But by the same token, this kind of was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Like getting to work at SpaceX is challenging. It's one of the most competitive jobs you could possibly get. I had an opportunity to work there, if even for a few months, and I knew it would do wonders for my career, and it would be a blast and an adventure anyway, which is ultimately what the purpose of backpacking Europe or whatever that was the stand-in label for would have been. So I knew it was going to be an adventure, and I wound up taking it. So that was what I actually did with my free summer after graduating college. I worked like 60 hours a week, but it was fun, and as you'll probably be able to tell throughout this video, I wouldn't trade it for the world. So that's how I got my internship. I should also mention, I graduated college like 3 years ago. So some of these details may have changed or may not be relevant anymore, but 3 years ago, the way it worked was if you had graduated college or you were a graduate student and you were doing an internship, you were referred to as an associate. So an associate is basically an intern with a bachelor's degree. And then if you were an undergrad, you were referred to as an intern. So I was referred to as an associate GNC engineer. I actually just wanted writing GNC engineer intern in my resume and everything because I didn't want to make it sound like I was trying to portray as full-time and it wasn't. So I just went with intern. But at the company, we were referred to as associates. So I was an associate working on the Starshield program, which I'll talk a little bit about what that is shortly. And I was there for 3 months in Los Angeles, in their main headquarters location. So that's Hawthorne. That's the one with the big booster in the front, the picture in the thumbnail. Now, what is Starshield? Starshield, which, for the record, this is where I drop off in terms of detail for obvious reasons. Starshield is Starlink, but for the government. So it's Starlink as applied to government and national security missions. That's basically what it is. You can imagine on the technical front, if you take the normal Starlink satellite and you change from the commercial / civilian applications that the very large Starlink constellation is built for, and now you have a very different customer with very different use cases and even technology they want to fly. The way you fly that satellite is going to be pretty significantly different, and that's what this GNC team in particular was all about. So obviously Starlink had their own GNC team, as did Falcon and Dragon and Starship and everything, but Starshield was specifically about taking those Starlink satellites and applying it to national security missions. So that's the GNC team I was a part of. I focus on attitude, determination, and control systems. So attitude, determination, and control is all about the orientation of the satellite. If you are going to be pointed in certain ways for communications or collecting power or anything else, you have to be able to slew to certain attitudes throughout your mission, and the systems that enable you to do that, like reaction wheels and torque rods and stuff like that. All that jazz is what attitude, determination, and control systems is about. So that's what I focused in on the GNC team for Starshield. So, okay, that's like the context of how I got the role and what it was about before getting into a little bit more technical detail in the next section. The last thing I'll say for this section, just to kind of not keep you in suspense, I didn't wind up getting a return offer for a lot of the same reasons I kind of described in the beginning, but I did end on really good terms with my team. I enjoyed working with them, it was a blast, and I got to do some incredibly kick-ass work we're going to discuss now. So that's pretty much all the context you need. Now let's talk about the work I actually did. So while I was there, I had a manager and a mentor. So the manager was kind of the manager of the entire team, like your supervisor. They also managed all of the full-time people. And then I also had a mentor who was an additional full-time engineer whose job it was to basically help me with my program. Now I'll talk about some of the boundaries that SpaceX does and doesn't set for their interns. Even though interns were largely expected to operate as full-time engineers, there's a lot of context you have to learn really quickly to be effective within the 3 months you're there, and so you are given a little bit of assistance through a mentor, and that's what that relationship was primarily about. I had two main projects while I was there. Again, keeping details light here, they were both within the attitude, determination, and control space, but they were pretty different in terms of actual workflow. The first one was very much a systems engineering type of project with just a lot of testing and simulation, mainly with respect to fault tolerance. So it wasn't about designing or building or implementing anything new. It was really about taking the systems that we currently had and making sure that they were sufficient and all the requirements were met for the applications they were actually being used for at the time. So lots of modeling and simulation, Monte Carlo stuff, verifying what does and doesn't work and catching any actually dangerous fault cases that we might want to design around later. But my project, as kind of the first entry-level internship project, was really about finding what those faults were through parameterized analysis techniques you may be familiar with. Design of experiments, all that kind of stuff. That's actually a large part of what my current work is about, but that's subject for another video. So that was the first project I did. After I kind of got a lay of the land of what the system was, how it worked, the different missions we were doing, through that fault tolerance testing oriented project, the next one I did was much more what you would traditionally consider engineering. So it was algorithm design and implementation. So we had certain algorithms running within flight software that we wanted to change how they worked for certain reasons. And so I had to go look at, through first principles, why the algorithm wasn't satisfying mission requirements and behaving properly, changing it accordingly, writing new code, running it through the same kinds of tests I just described with the first project, making sure it's going to behave the way we want, and then ultimately shipping it to be real flight software. So that was much more of like an actual engineering kind of building piece, whereas the first one was more of an analytic piece. So those were the two projects I had throughout the 3 months I was there. And we were really expected to operate as full-time engineers. So I'll talk about this more in the advice section. But one thing I think interns don't realize, I think they subconsciously hedge themselves against the kindness and the slack that interns typically get. Can you get away with more stuff as an intern than you otherwise could as a full-time engineer? Absolutely, of course you can. But if you really want to get a job, the barometer, the benchmark you're being measured against is a full-time engineer, because if they were going to go hire you, they're going to hire you as a full-time engineer. So you got to be ready to play ball with all the full-timers, even if you're just an intern and even if you just graduated college like I had. So we were really expected to operate with a lot of autonomy. I will say I did struggle with this at first. Like, it's a very daunting, intimidating place. There's a lot of systems you got to understand. There's a lot of stuff you got to know. And it took me a minute or two to get the ball rolling. But at that point, you really got to lock in and operate as you would as a full-timer, because if you want to get that return offer, that's the benchmark against which you're measured. So I completed these projects largely on my own, just with some help from my mentor along the way. And I wound up presenting this work to the team as a full-time engineer would. So the first one was a bunch of results from the analysis I did. And the second was actually like a code review of the algorithms I implemented, designed, tested, etc. So I had to present this work as any other engineer on the team would. That's largely what my performance was measured against. Like, how effectively did I perform on those two projects? Really enjoyed those presentations. Learned a lot about not just presentation skills, but also myself. Like, it's a very intimidating process to go and present your work to a bunch of incredibly smart engineers, which is really all SpaceX hires, is incredibly smart engineers. So that was cool. One last kind of intimidating, daunting piece. People talk about the hours at SpaceX. It was definitely real in my case. I worked 55 to 60 hours a week pretty much the whole time. And I'll elaborate on what my schedule was like in the life section, but I hauled ass for the 3 months I was there. It was a ton of work. And by the way, I knew lots of other interns were working 70 hours a week nonstop, especially at the launch sites like Cape Canaveral and other places. It was a lot of work, as you probably are not surprised by if you know anything about SpaceX and what the work culture was like. It was really amazing. I learned a ton. I'll save all the fluffy stuff for the end, but just take my word for it now that it was worth it. Like, especially as an intern, with that being temporary, it was an amazing experience to just kind of sprint for 3 months and learn more in that time than I did in like several years of classes in school. I'll leave that for the life part, which we're gonna get to now. So what's life like as an intern at SpaceX? A few things to know. For one, I was part of a very large intern class. It wasn't like some smaller companies I've also interned at where, you kind of show up and you're just immediately shepherded into whatever your team is, and then you start working with them, largely on your own schedule. Like whenever you start, you just kind of start working. These larger companies, and I know SpaceX is not the only one to do this, they have batches, they have classes of interns that come in, and you all get your orientation at once. You have a little party, barbecue, whatever, you meet the other interns, and then you are sent off to your team. It's kind of like, in preschool where parents come and drop their kids off. It's basically like that. Like you go through this orientation, they tell you some of the basic stuff, what to do, what not to do, and then you're sent off to your team. But what's nice about that is you actually meet a lot of people that way, people who are entirely other sides of the space. I knew people who were purely in software, so nothing to do with aerospace. I knew a bunch of structural, aerodynamic, thermal people. I knew some business people, whether marketing or ops, stuff like that. I met lots of other interns, again, all of whom were incredibly like high achievers. I got massive imposter syndrome because it was all kids from MIT and Stanford. And while I do love my alma mater, I didn't go to MIT or Stanford. So it was really cool to meet a bunch of people from all over the country with different backgrounds and different work areas while at SpaceX. So you learn a lot that way. Speaking of Los Angeles, I was very much alone in LA, right? At the time, this is embarrassing to say out loud, but at the time it kind of reminded me of the intro to GTA Online, if you ever played that, where your guy flies in on the plane and then Lamar's there to pick you up at Los Santos International, which is obviously LAX, and then you're just dropped into the sandbox that is GTA to go do whatever. That's pretty much what it felt like for me. I flew in on a Sunday. I saw in the intern class Discord or something, whatever it was, that a bunch of people were grabbing dinner, so I ate with them, went to sleep in this random Airbnb I was in, and the next morning woke up and it was kind of game on. So that was very cool. Living out on my own was amazing, especially right after college, and LA is a pretty fun place to be. That was very interesting. It was kind of cool to just be part of this big batch of kids that was just dropped into LA kind of randomly and not knowing anybody. And I still have some close friends that I still am in regular contact with and know about their work, know what they're up to, know what their ambitions are from this experience. So if you invest in it socially, you will make good friends. And it's kind of a pressure cooker for close relationships because you're all working so hard and so high stress and you're all out on your own. So it was really fun in that way. I would say there were two main kinds of people in terms of work schedule. Pretty much everybody was pulling long hours, but people tended to approach it in kind of one of two ways. The first way is really the more balanced way, which is like spreading your work out over longer periods of time throughout the week. So working in bursts, but also including the weekend, right? If you're doing like 60 hours a week, maybe you're doing 10 hours a day, and then you're doing half a day on Saturday and half a day on Sunday, just as an example. Or maybe you would take giant breaks in the middle. So their day was like really 2 5-hour chunks rather than a contiguous work day. So there were people who tried to kind of spread out the burden over more time. And then there were people who just whole hogged it during the week and then had their fun on the weekend. And this is the camp I was largely in. So I was in the office pretty much 12 hours a day, Monday through Friday. So this is what my schedule looked like. I would work from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. Monday through Friday. The variance between 55 and 60 hours a week was largely just how long of a lunch and or dinner I would take throughout each day. So I was in the office 12 hours a day, Monday to Friday, and then Saturday I would party my ass off. I would go do all the fun stuff on the beach or out in bars and clubs and all that shenanigans that the college kids do with my friends on Saturday. And then Sunday I would rest / basically collapse, spend Sunday in bed. So that was my kind of schedule. Not the most sustainable, but for a 23-year-old random single dude in Los Angeles, it got the job done. It was a lot of fun. So that was what I did pretty much the entire internship. I will say part of at least the internship experience, I'm sure this is different from full-timers who have relationships and families and stuff like that, but as an intern, my entire social life was at work, right? I didn't have any other friends in other parts of LA to go and spend time with anyway. So I would have a lot of fun in headquarters with all my buddies who were also working long hours. So the 12 hours really flew by. I'd be lying to you if I said I worked the full 60 hours, 12 hours a day every week without any breaks. You know, I did fun stuff while I was still on the Hawthorne campus and had a blast doing it. So I was working 12 hours a day on paper, but it didn't really feel like 12 hours a day. It was more like 12 hours at the office, which is basically where my entire life was centered around for the 3 months I was there, with a couple of breaks and fun stuff sprinkled here and there. So that's what life was like for me. One other thing I'll mention, just on the life front, the pay was good at SpaceX. I mean, there are definitely internships that pay better, but GNC is a pretty well-paying area. SpaceX paid their interns really well. It's also worth noting that like California has some pretty generous overtime laws, and those apply to us as hourly workers. And so, yeah, the money was good for me to have a bunch of fun and do a bunch of cool stuff in LA, which is not cheap, but do a bunch of fun stuff while I was there and then save a little bit of money for afterwards, which definitely was cheaper than a Europe trip. Part of what I thought about was like, well, these two things are both fun adventures, but one of them is going to cost me a ton of money and the other one is going to make me a little bit of money. So anyway, the main reason for doing this was definitely not the money. I'll get to some of the main reasons I did it and why I got value from it in a moment, but the money was good, and I just think that's worth mentioning. So let's talk about overall thoughts. What was it really like? How do I reflect on this experience? Honestly, it was awesome. It was like one of the best experiences I had in college. You know, it's technically not considered part of college because I had graduated, but pretty much after this, internships are no longer available to people. Now I'm only applying for full-time roles. So this was kind of the swan song, for lack of a better word, of my undergraduate degree. A lot of people did wind up going like backpacking Europe, kind of finding themselves and doing something a little bit more personal life coded than this, but it was great. I really consider it an adventure. And did I spend most of my time sitting at a desk? Of course I did, but it was an awesome experience and I wouldn't trade it for anything. In terms of where the value comes from, obviously there's the fluffy, life experience, adventure, yada, yada, I just described. There's the pay, pay was good, got to save some money. The biggest thing, which I really think is hard to understand until you've experienced it, is the name brand recognition of a company like SpaceX. I'm not gonna go make a list or a tier list or anything of like the best engineering companies, the most prestigious engineering companies. There's a bunch of other people who will do that, of varying qualifications to do that, but whatever. But what I will say is there are some S-tier companies out there, and we all know them when we see or hear them, right? There are companies that are the best. They're the hot, sexy thing. Everybody there's making a lot of money through their stock or just being paid well because they're top talent. It attracts the top people. And when you leave that kind of place, that name carries weight, right? It stays with you. And if you see people on LinkedIn that say like X SpaceX or X whatever, this is why they do it. It's a little cringy. Yeah, it's a little cringy, but it works. Works to say, hey, I worked at SpaceX. I could hang with the best of them in this environment, and I can perform really well for you in whatever company I'm currently applying for. That name brand recognition of an S-tier company, like a top company, really, really does carry weight, and it's done me wonders in my career. That's part of what I tried to allude to on my engineering credential tier list. Like, engineers are very analytic people, so they're always focused on the specific work they did. And while the work I did at SpaceX was great, and I did learn a ton on the technical side, like, I learned so much stuff and got to wear so many different hats. The technical learning was great, but the name brand recognition is something people kind of sleep on a little bit, and I think it's worth mentioning because it's still paying off, even though I was just an intern. Like, I was only there for 3 months, so I never posited to be some high roller at the company. That's part of why I haven't made this video for so long. I want to make sure I do it right and don't sound like I'm just trying to brag. I was there for 3 months. I got a great experience out of it. I learned a lot, and I get to carry that name with me in whatever capacity being an intern there affords you, which so far has been pretty good. So in terms of value, I'd say those are the main things. What about advice? What's some advice I would give to anybody who's going to be an intern at SpaceX? For one, I would say at SpaceX especially, I would give this advice to anybody doing an internship anywhere that they actually want to get the job. But this is especially true at SpaceX. You are treated as a full-time engineer at the #1 aerospace company in the world, period. Nobody pulls any punches for you, so expect to lock the hell in. You're going to be held to the same standard as everybody else, especially if you want to get a return offer. So don't expect to just have your hand held through it because you're just an intern. There's really no differentiation between intern and non-intern in terms of what you're actually expected to be able to do. So speaking of that, there's this piece on autonomy again. I've mentioned autonomy in several videos at this point. You have to be able to operate with a high degree of agency, find problems, debug them, come up with solutions, implement them, test them, present those results. Like, you have to be willing and able to do all of these things. There's no kind of assembly line. You do this widget, hand it off to this guy. He does this widget, hand it off to that guy. Like, that doesn't happen. Like, you have to be the full responsible engineer. That's like where the term RE, responsible engineer, comes in. You are the responsible engineer for whatever your project or assignment actually is, so be prepared to take it across the full 100 yards, not just 10. So that's really important. Another thing I would say is keeping track, keeping your bearings of where you're at. As an intern, a lot of times, if you're really dedicated, if you're really passionate, you can kind of muscle up and do what I just described. Like you can rise to the occasion. I really do believe that. I definitely did not have the capabilities to do the things I did at SpaceX at the beginning of my internship there. Like, I was woefully underprepared, so I had to learn it all as I went, right? And people can largely do that. But make sure as you're going, for one, you're keeping good communication with your manager and mentor, because they're going to largely be your guide. You're expected to do things on your own, but you are given guidance about what you are supposed to do and how long you have to do it and what some of the expectations are. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a functioning organization. Like, that's just how everybody works, full-timers included. So keep good communication with your manager and mentor, and also, like, write everything down. Like, write everything down. Everything you're doing, all the problems you're facing, all the advice you get from people, all the deliverables you have, what the deadlines for those are. However you want to do it, whether it's in your phone or in a notebook, like I had a notebook, write everything down, because as a young person, it's really easy to lose your bearings, and that's going to significantly impede your ability to actually perform. So keep track of everything, be diligent, and make sure you're tracking the progress you make as you're working really hard. And the last piece of advice I'll give is just, this is specifically for the interns out there, right? Because I understand full-time engineers, it's different. Not everybody wants to work in this kind of environment, but I'm talking to the interns here. If you're an intern and you are still in school, give this 100%. Leave everything on the table and then some, because what will happen, and this is part of where this name brand recognition comes in, is bust your ass, do incredibly amazing, challenging work, and then when you leave, everything you do after will be easier, unless you go to another S-tier company, which is, again, a good problem to have. If you are an intern, this is a high likelihood that this is the most impressive thing you do in your undergraduate or graduate education, like at least on the professional side. There is this high likelihood that this is the highest magnitude, highest ROI thing that you're gonna do during your college career. For me, it's definitely one of them. Like, I would say it's up there with the cumulative sum of all the other internships I did, the classes I took. If you think of the big, broad strokes of what you're gonna do when you're in college, this internship, it has a high likelihood of being one of them. So leave it all on the table. Even if you're in the office 12 hours a day, I promise you, it will be worth it. And it will be something you can look back on. Did I enjoy every day I was in LA? Of course not. There were some super stressful days. There were arguments. There were things I messed up. It was not perfect at all, but I look back on it so fondly because it gave me a lot and it taught me a lot, not just about my career, but about my life. So I would highly advise giving it 100%, leave nothing on the table, and best of luck to you. Like I said, I'm the Unhinged Engineer. I make professional development content for other engineers like myself. I normally don't talk about my own experiences in this much detail, but I just figured there'd be interest given current events with the IPO and everything. Most of what I talk about is advice for other engineers trying to navigate their way in the engineering field. The career space is very, very treacherous right now. There's lots of layoffs, it's hard to find jobs, and so just about anything we can do to maximize our chances of success, I think everybody deserves to have that information. So that's what I share on this channel. Thanks a lot for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you next time.